Is that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question. I call the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Who are we as Australians if we can't tell our own stories? Who are we as Australians if we don't know our own stories? Who are we as Australians if we don't have an industry of creatives, of screenwriters, playwrights, actors? Who are we if we can't tell our own stories? Australian stories matter. Growing up, watching Play School and Humphrey B. Bear, watching the Henderson Kids, BMX Bandits, when Mum and Dad didn't notice, sneaking in to watch a country practice. Growing up, seeing Australian faces, hearing Australian voices, watching Australian stories. It would be a tragedy if the generations to come don't get to grow up watching Australian stories, hearing Australian voices. It's why content rules matter. It has an economic impact, supports small businesses, supports individuals to pursue their craft. It builds an economic ecosphere in Australia around film and TV production. But Australian content rules are more than an economic question. They're actually about the soul of a country and the content of a country and how we depict ourselves, how we know ourselves, how we portray ourselves to the rest of the world. It matters that we have a vibrant and diverse film and television industry in Australia. It matters for how we see ourselves, and it matters for how others see us. We don't want a generation of Australian children growing up thinking that everyone speaks with an American accent, or not having any understanding of some of Australia's history because they haven't seen it portrayed on their phones or their iPads or whatever devices they'll be watching on the next 20, 30 years. That's why Australian content matters. It's a ethical thing, it's a moral thing, it's a cultural thing about making sure that we are protecting and projecting Australian stories, Australian voices and Australian faces. And that's why I'm proud to be part of a Labor Party who are taking a stance to say we won't be party to dismantling screen content rules. You know, as I said, it is those rules which mean that we have an Australian screen industry. It's those rules that mean, excuse it's those rules that mean that we can tell our stories to ourselves and to the world. It's beyond time that this government put forward an actual package of reforms to Parliament to deal with the changing nature of film and television, to deal with screening via streaming services, the difference between free-to-air television and paid television. We need a package of reforms that comprehensively deals with the world we're in, where we're moving to. Thank you. And which preserves those precious Australian stories. It was 2017 when then Minister Fifield announced a broad-ranging and comprehensive review of Australian and children's content, saying that the review would identify sustainable policies to ensure the ongoing availability of Australian and children's content to domestic and international audiences, regardless of platform. But yet, in June of 2021, there's nothing to modernise Australian content obligations for the contemporary media environment which now includes streaming video platforms. The problem with this bill is that it proposes to halve Foxtel's Australian screen content obligation without putting anything in its place. There's no requirement, for example, for streaming services like Netflix to produce Australian content. And that's what a federal government is for, to put in this context, requirements to protect Australian industry and Australian content. We've seen this government water down Australian screen content rules before when it comes to commercial free-to-air television broadcasters. It was September of last year that the minister announced changes to the drama, documentary and children's content sub-quota Australian content rules for broadcasters. They didn't come before the parliament, those changes, but were made by the ACMA at the direction of the minister. The same sub-quotas were suspended in 2020 as an emergency COVID-19 measure and then reintroduced in watered-down form from the 1st of January this year. We said at that time these changes would mean fewer Australian stories on our television screens and fewer job opportunities for local creators. In the context of a government that is talking up job creation as part of the economic recovery, it is incomprehensible that apparently job opportunities for local creators don't matter. In the context of a government that likes to talk all the time about Australian values and standing up for Australia, it's incomprehensible that the government doesn't stand up for Australian content, for those very same Australian values, for that very same country to be portrayed in documentaries, television series, films to our citizens and across the world. There has been a profound failure to make it Australian, to pick up that campaign. There has been a profound failure for the creators and the small businesses that comprise the screen sector. There has been a profound failure for Australians who want more Australian stories. Just a couple of weeks ago, I received an email from a constituent. I'm pretty privileged to represent an electorate which has a range of amazing creative people in it. I have children's authors like Danielle Binks. I have photograph journalists like Vivian Zink. And I have Chris Gist, who emailed me, who's been involved in film and television for 30 years and commissioned some of Australia's favourite dramas, Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, Jack Irish, the Dr Blake Mysteries and more. He's worked in Australia, he's worked internationally. And as he said to me in his email, he knows how valuable this kind of media is, both for the national audience and as an unparalleled form of national cultural projection. In fact, he just finished shooting an independent feature film on the Mornington Peninsula, starring Nadine Garner. I'm still a bit upset that I didn't know she was in my neck of the woods, so I couldn't go and be a fangirl, but I've mentioned that to Chris and we're going to sort that out later. But by filming that in the Mornington Peninsula area, that put a lot of money into the local community, as well as filming local content. Chris is concerned, he says to me, that local content is taking yet another knock with federal changes to the relevant legislation. Chris wrote to me that writers and producers like my wife and I, alongside the broader Australian film and television industry, really need your support in stopping the erosion of the content requirements. He's got a number of requests, which I've said to Chris I personally think are eminently sensible. Regulation of streaming services. 20% of locally sourced revenue should be invested in new Australian content. The retention of the Gallipoli clause to allow feature filmmakers to claim for Aussie story elements shot offshore, and the retention of current expenditure thresholds for feature-length content at $500,000. Chris wrote to me that last September the Morrison government announced significant changes to local content rules on free-to-air commercial television and introduced a point system that will cause, and he put the following in bold, an annual decline in drama production of $100 million. To maintain the growth in Australia's much-loved screen industry, streaming services need to be required to invest in local content. They have done phenomenally well during COVID. Netflix and Amazon Prime earn $1.7 to $2 billion annually from Australian subscribers, but year after year pay little tax here in Australia. Based on international precedent, Chris went on to say, streaming services should have to invest at least 20% of their locally sourced revenue in producing new Australian content. This will create 10,000 jobs and stimulate the economic growth that Minister Fletcher aims for. By comparison, the EU's Audiovisual Media Directive pegs local European content at 30% and ensures prominence of those works. This, of course, needs to be new content and not just the low-cost licensing of tired old titles. Of course, Chris says, and I join with him, that we welcome the government's recent announcement that the feature film producer offset will be retained at 40%. And I interrupt Chris's email to pay some tribute to Brian Brown and other actors and actresses who came to Canberra to lobby so hard for the government to do that. Chris signed off by saying, "Thank you, Peter, for looking at this. Your backing of Australian stories and storytellers is essential to ensuring our life on screen isn't lost. Hashtag make it Australian." So I speak on behalf of Chris and everyone in the industry to say that this government must do more to protect Australian content, and it can start by supporting Labor's amendment to this legislation. The government's cut ABC funding and reduced funding available for the ABC to invest in Australian content. It's watered down Australian content obligations for commercial TV, and now with this bill the government seeks to halve Foxtel's expenditure obligation. I don't know how that sits with also giving Foxtel $30 million to supposedly put women's sport on television, which was a very narrow-cast way to try to promote women's sport. Would have been better to put that into the public broadcaster with a requirement that it promote, as it has done for decades, Australian sport. And for streaming providers, there remains no obligation at all. It's hard. It's hard to regulate new industries. It's hard to keep up in legislative form with changes to technology. There is no doubt about that. Market conditions are challenging. There is a regulatory disparity between broadcasters and streaming services. But just because something is hard doesn't mean you keep kicking the can down the road. If something's hard, you roll up your sleeves and you get stuck into it and do it, particularly when it's something that goes to the core of being Australian. It goes to the core of promoting our voice to ourselves and the world. So I urge this government, I urge the minister to reconsider your position on halving Foxtel's content obligation, and to really, as you go about consulting on future changes, listen to the input from the people that work in the industry. Listen to the Chris's of the world, the independent contractors, the small business people, the actors, the screenwriters, the set producers, the people that work in the industry that I don't know what the titles of their jobs are, but all of those people who rely on Australian content for their livelihood and who produce Australian content for the cultural wealth of our country. Listen to them, Minister, and act on what they say.